Well, here we are at the end of Romans. It's taken us nearly as long to study it as it did for them to live it. And it's time now to bring it all to a head. I have been struck, as I did my part in it, how prone we are to treat Scripture as being sacred, and nothing wrong with that. That's kind of how things are. But I always have an urge to humanize things, to find points of connection and identification between us and them, because everything means more to me when we do that. And so that's my goal today. I want to finish up talking about Romans, to personalize that, hopefully to touch us in the same way that they were touched. Let me say just a few things about the letter itself. That the guy that was Paul's secretary, his amanuensis is the theological word. Can you imagine how long that took for him to dictate that? And what was involved in just physical work to produce that document? I don't know how we say that guy's name, Tertius, probably. I went to the Greek Bible and looked it up, and it's Terteros. I don't think we want to be quite that formal in how we say it. But you got to hand it to this guy. He was dedicated to do what he did. Now, when Paul wrote Colossians, he said he was writing that with his own hand, and we think probably the reason for that is because he did it at the same time he did Philemon. And Philemon is usually looked at as a legal document where he says, I'll pay whatever that boy stole and carried off. I write this with my own hand, I will repay it. And then, of course, it says in it with his tongue in his cheek, to say nothing of you're owing me your own self. The thing is long, and it's involved, and a lot of the people that heard it couldn't read. And can you imagine how hard they had to work and struggle to try to get around the things that have challenged us so much? One of the first things I said when we started Romans was to quote Roman Kelsey. He was quoting somebody when he said that, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the famous British poet, who said that Romans is maybe the profoundest document ever written, and that may very well be right. And it was a job then, and it's a job now, but it's well worth it. History says that. I need to say a few things about this church. When you've spent your life working with and for churches and church-related things, that's always one of your first impulses is, how were things for the church? Let me run through a quick little thumbnail sketch of what was going on in that church. First of all, it was not yet a crime to be a Christian, in their terms, a member of the sect called the Nazarenes. But that wasn't going to last, that condition wasn't going to last very long. It's less than 10 years after this thing was written before it became a crime to be a Christian, and many people lost their lives. That is not to say that Christians were always well treated. They were charged with various kinds of heresies and all that. Because they wouldn't worship the Roman gods, they were thought of as atheists. And when the Romans heard them talking about the sun and eating the flesh of the sun, they were accused of being cannibals, of killing and eating their children and all that stuff. They weren't treated very well. It wasn't then like it is now, to where when people find out that you go to church, they say, oh, good, well, that's fine. But it wasn't a crime yet, not a capital crime at least. In that church, they had all kinds of people. They had ex-idolaters. people who had worshipped the thousands of idols in one way or another, and sometimes lots of ways. And while they had pulled away from that, they were still kind of ambivalent about it, especially in things like, is it all right for me to eat food that has been sacrificed to idols? This church had Jews in it, and they were proud of it. They were of the circumcision, and whatever else they bragged about that. And they looked down on other people who were not Jews. And he gets on them and says, y'all been doing the same kind of stuff these other people have been doing, and you need to straighten up and quit that. There were educated people, and there were barbarians. We know that when he talked about barbarians, these were people that were sort of semi-savages. And when they talked, their language sounded like they were saying bar, 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 which is why they were called barbarians. So every level of education. They had various marriage states. This was a time of polygamy and of all kinds of strange and horrible things that went on about marriage. And he regulates that to tell them what to do and not do. That's still a big problem for churches. When churches are reaching out to the public, wherever they are, they find that half the people they deal with have got some strange marriage set up, and almost every family of us can testify to that in one way or another. They were searching for their place in God's church. What should I be doing and how should I do it? And his advice to them about that is, whatever you've been assigned to do in God's kingdom, do it wholeheartedly. Searching for their place. We know some of them were very serious because they had church in their house. That meant that they had some kind of holdings to be able to have people congregate in their house, and that testifies to their seriousness because the house then was a place of refuge, the same as it is now. They had all kinds of folks, and we think they included soldiers in the Roman army, and we know from Romans itself that they had city officials who were members of that church. So I want to pull all that together and say it was a mixed bag. They didn't all look alike, they didn't all sound alike, they didn't all think alike. And his plea to them is, need to be united nevertheless. Let love tie you together and be a people of faith. An interesting church, and the things that developed out of that for the next 1,000 years are interesting and the subject of an appropriate lifetime of study. Now, to humanize things just a little bit more, it's always my approach to that kind of stuff to compare it to how things are now as we analyze our situation. You've heard my speech about I wish you knew my grandma. What I was searching for there was a model to hold in front of people about how to behave and how to have a good life. And it wasn't going to be me, wasn't going to be my immediate family, wasn't going to be them, because always there was something that disqualified that, so I used my grandma. With your permission, I would like to talk about my church. In 1960, I graduated from Abilene Christian College with a BA in Bible. It was close whether I was going to make it or not. I've told the story many times about knowing that I was going to come up $132 short of being able to get my bill all paid. Went in to talk to the officer who handled things like that and said I need to make a loan or something else. And he said, I don't like to make loans. That's not a good thing. Go on home and I'll think about it and get back to you. And a week later, I got a letter from him that said I'd been granted a $132 scholarship. One of the profs, who was a close friend of mine, helped me get a job preaching at a little town in central Texas at the end of that summer after I graduated. And I want to talk about that church for a little while because I've told thousands of stories about it. And because I was a single, young man, bulletproof, highly motivated to make my way in the world, it was 3 of the most important years of my life, though not always 3 of the best. So I need to say a few things about my church. When I went to talk to them about becoming their preacher, did that obligatory tryout Sunday, where you pull out your best sermon and preach it on Sunday morning and hope you didn't turn everybody off and maybe they'll offer you the job. Met with those guys that night. There were 5 of them that had been picked by the church, not as elders, but as managers. They didn't have any elders, and I'll say a word about that in a minute. They offered me that job, and they said, there are as many of us in the Church of Christ in this town who never ever go, means they didn't come to church, as do go. And what we see as your first job, if you take this job, is to get those people back in church. Well, being 22 and highly motivated, that sounded easy to me, so I was not at all daunted by that. Just a word about what had led to that situation. This church had 2 or 3 preachers in a row for several years who were oddballs. They had agendas, they had hobbies, they didn't understand what's required for unity in a church, and they participated in being divisive. There were 2 things that had happened to tear that church apart. One was their building. Because it was a good-sized church and pretty well off, they had seen the need to build a pretty fancy building, and they got rooked, in the words of my grandma. They hired a builder who told them what they wanted to hear and sold them a pile of junk. When I saw that building, I was impressed with how it looked, and when I really looked at it, I found out that it was in danger of falling down, and that was true the whole time, and they were terribly frustrated about that and angry at each other, even several years later by the time I went there. So a negative experience about a building, that was one. And the other was they got started disagreeing and couldn't quit. They couldn't find a way or leaders to turn that in the right direction so that what didn't matter remained in that place in favor of what did matter. And so there were 2 camps. They knew that that was unworkable, but they didn't know what to do about it. So I took that job, and on a hot August day in 1960, went to be their preacher. And I did that for almost exactly 3 years. I want to say some things about what went on for me and that group in that time to kind of apply the book of Romans to our day-to-day situation today. First of all, let me say a word about their knowledge of the Bible. It didn't take long for me to find out that there were people in that church that knew more about the Bible than I did, even though I had that wonderful BA degree from Abilene Christian College. For one thing, they were good in the old Bible, which I've said many times I'm not, wasn't then and I'm not now. And they studied it every day, spent a lot of time in study. And I would have to classify them just as being not clergy, but just ordinary folk, as being unusually gifted in the use of the Bible. They loved it, and they understood it, and acted accordingly. That's one side, and on the other side, there were many who couldn't find their Bible. They had other things that guided them, though they kind of waved their hand at the Bible, and I recognized that that was to be something of a challenge. In that church, which looked like a typical small town church, the assumption was going to be that everybody was of a certain class, and that was going to be relatively poor. They weren't, but in that church there were several wealthy people, prosperous farmers. Their farm areas where they did their thing, and then the big crop was cotton, resembled those Amish farms in Pennsylvania where it looks like you could eat off the barn floor. And they were careful with their money, how they dealt with it. They were well known for being honest and paying their bills and all that. There was one man in particular who really liked me, and we got to be good friends over the years that I was there, who was his parents and grandparents had been car dealers, and he inherited all that, and he was quite wealthy. Taught me a lot about wealth, though I couldn't do anything about it, and he loved to give me gifts. I still smile as I think about some of those. On one trip that he took to the Near East, he brought me a rock to carry in my pocket and rub in my hand when I got nervous, a stress rock or something of that sort. And the other gift from that trip was he had been somewhere that they were closing a hospital, and he got me a wooden lunch tray with folding legs. I don't know what I was supposed to do with that. I never did sit with a tray in my house where I camped out that way. But anyway, these people were pretty well off, and I had a lot to learn from them about that. Let me speak of this group of people as being far-reaching in their effect on the world. Time after time after time, I got acquainted with children, grandchildren, acquaintances, people they had dealt with over the years, people that had all kind of interesting connections that were very surprising. College officials, law enforcement, all kinds of important political places. And every time I got acquainted with a new one, it was like, that wasn't quite what I expected. They had far more outreach into the world, particularly of Texas, but even internationally, than you could possibly imagine. And I found that very gratifying, especially when those people came to the town, and I got to meet them in person. One little interesting story was not only about the church, but about the town, where that whole town was like that. I had been bragging about some musicians to a group of people who didn't like the same kind of music I did, and I used the name Ray Leatherwood, who was a famous bass player. And this guy, a friend of mine who carried the mail, said, "Oh yeah, I know him. His parents live next door to me." "What? What do you say?" He said, "Yeah, I know him. His parents live next door to me. Next time he comes to town, I'll call you and you can meet him." "Oh man, yes, I'd love to meet him." Well, he made that happen. And as we were ending our visit, me and Ray Leatherwood, he said, "I understand that you play the guitar." And I said, "The way I play the guitar is not what you mean by playing the guitar. I thump around on one." He said, "Well, next time I come to town, I'll bring my bass and we'll jam a little bit." And I'll play golf with Jack Nicklaus the next time he comes to town. But the church was particularly like that. It was surprising about who they knew and who they had connections with. Talk about inside the church. As I look back on that, I think about all the things that came out of that. In my youth group, there was a guy that became a doctor, one who became a vet, one who became a New York designer, several who had important political jobs, and as I look back at that over the years, it's like, good night. I didn't sense exactly how much potential those kids had. So I think about that, and I think about this Roman church, the effect that they had. It wasn't going to be all that many years until that church took over the world, that became how things were in that whole part of the world. All kinds of interesting people there. A lot of them married while I was there. It seemed to me like every Friday night I was doing a wedding. And they were kind of fun. Weddings are, but sometimes people misbehave at weddings, and sometimes they did. And sometimes they were very pretentious, but most of the time they were things that just made you smile. The people in this church looked amazingly like my parents, as far as age was concerned and status and everything. And in many ways they were like my parents, and in many ways they weren't. Some of them died. Seemed to me like there was a whole crop of those right after I got there. It's almost like they had been saving up so I could do some funerals. I could tell all kinds of stories about that. I'll just do a couple of brief notes. On a hot afternoon, somebody came running breathlessly to find me and said, Terry Jackson just died. He was one of those prosperous farmers that looked like he could eat off the floor of the barn. He had been working under the sink at home, fixing some minor leak in the sink. His wife said he started to raise up and said Belvy, which was her name, and fell over dead. You can't imagine the effect that had on that church, on me, being, I suppose at that time I was 23, trying to get my arms around that and to understand what was going on with somebody who had been married as long as they had. Another one that was especially touching to me, on a Saturday I drove to Norman to see OU play somebody in football, and drove home that night knowing I had to be there the next day, of course, to preach. Got home about midnight and my phone rang almost immediately. It was my preacher friend from Fort Worth who had come from that town, a very influential preacher in the Church of Christ in Fort Worth. My daddy died today. I'd like to ask you to go to the funeral home and sit with him until morning. When other people come, would you be willing to do that? Well, of course I would. They had the custom in that town of sitting with the body, never leaving it alone from death until burial. Because I was close to him and close to them, I was glad to go do that. There were others that you thought were going to die and didn't. There was one that I sat up with some at night in the hospital who was then of the age that I am now. One night we were visiting when he was sleepless, and he said a line that I still recall, James, I knew this was coming. I just didn't know it was coming so quickly. So today I say to that, well, amen, brother. And one of my favorite stories that I've told many times, and most of you have heard it, in my psych class, in talking about epistemology, how we know things, I talked about intuition, where you just know something and you don't know how you know it. I sat up with this old man a few nights because his family was worn out. He was in his upper 80s and terribly ill and was going to die. And one morning I go home about 6 and go to bed. I was single and having responsibility, so that was no problem. About 8, I woke up knowing that he had died. Had no idea how I knew that. Cleaned up and went over there to plan for the funeral. The family was surprised to see me because he was still alive and lived 3 more years. So, there were many who died. And I look back on that and think in a most unplanned way, they contributed to my education. These people loved life. They loved to party. They loved to eat. Most of them, everybody that I knew about was a teetotaler. There was no drinking that went on that I know about. And at that time, I was a religious teetotaler. I'm still a teetotaler, but I'm not a religious teetotaler. They had 42 parties and I got invited to some of those, and then I got disinvited because I caught them cheating. Talked about that eating business. The woman who was considered to be the best cook in the town was one of our members. She cooked huge meals for the Rotary Club, for Lions Club, for alumni gatherings, and for everyone else. And her yeast rolls were comparable to Judy's. People sometimes ate nothing but the yeast rolls. So this was a bunch of people that loved life and did all those good things together. Let me say just a personal note is they expressed an excessive concern about my love life. I didn't keep track, but there were several people who made a date with me and talked to me like this. Now, James, I need to say to you that you're doing well here as our minister, and we love you and appreciate what you're doing, but you would be much happier if you had a wife. So why don't you find you a good wife who will do what wives do to help ministers? Your life will be better and so will ours. I always said, well, okay, you got anybody in mind? I hadn't met Judy yet, so who knew how that was going to work out? And that's still in process, so there you have it. I thought they were a little bit too nosy about all that. Now to bring all that to a head, that was my only church as the preacher. My first one and my last one. It wasn't long after I got there until I figured out I wasn't cut out to do that. I'd been telling people since I was 15 that I was going to be a minister, and they always said real nice things like, oh, that's so nice. We're so glad you're going to do that. They didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't know what I was talking about. People have asked me many times over the years, why did you quit being a preacher? The best I can put it is that I did not have the drive in me to wake up every day and go persuade people older and smarter than me to see things my way and to do what I wanted them to. I had a certain amount of influence. As I look back on it, I think my influence reached for 21 miles. It was about 21 miles to this town where I went often to entertain. People from the church there got me to play guitar and MC and sing. And I still was singing then. I hadn't heard myself yet. I didn't know what it sounded like. One case in particular, a lady called and wanted to know if I would come to that town, they had 3 large churches of Christ there, and marry her son and his girlfriend. All the preachers were going to be gone or wouldn't do it or whatever. Oh, yeah, sure. What? Are you an ordained minister? Yeah, I'm ordained. I can marry and all that. Well, ours is a little bit unusual. Our son is 15 and a half. Whoa. We've already been to court and taken care of all that, and there's nothing irregular about it. So I went over and married them. They lived in one of those frame houses, kind of like there in Midwest City. Bill Atkinson built after the war. And they would fit nicely into our group. They would not be at all unusual. It was Friday night, and there was going to be a football game back home, so I hurried home. This kid had come up to me after the wedding and stuck something in my coat pocket. So I knew he'd put some money in there, and I'm thinking, oh, kid, don't do that. You're 15 and a half. You need that money way worse than I do. Somebody at the ball game said, did you get paid? Well, I did, as a matter of fact. Well, what did you get paid? It was $2. That $2, ooh, I wish I hadn't got that $2. Paul did not have my problem, where I was not driven to persuade people to see things my way and do things my way, all out of proportion to how I saw my value. That's exactly what he spent his life doing. He has said to these Romans, I want to come and see you, and I want you to help me as I go to Spain. This is an old guy with some kind of problem, and he's acting like somebody who is in the pink of health. And he says, I'm going to take this offering that I've been picking up to Jerusalem. And we know how that turned out. He was driven to do that and to write this book. Aren't you glad he did? Let me finish all this by saying it came time for me to leave that town. As much as I had enjoyed all that, and I hadn't grown a whole lot. Conceptually, intellectually, organizationally, are all the ways you can grow. And I knew that time was slipping away from me and I needed to do something else. In August of 1963, somebody named Phil Watson called me and said, I want you to come to Oklahoma Christian College and work for me. I came to talk to him, and he talked me into it. He had a certain persuasiveness about him, and I wasn't too hard to persuade. And so on a Sunday night, with my car loaded up with all my worldly possessions, I preached my last sermon at that church. Drove to Oklahoma to spend the night with my parents, to go to work at OCC the next morning, choking with grief. That just about killed me, leaving that town. I was so close to those people, and that meant so much to me. Walking into OCC, I stepped into a situation 1,000 times more serious than mine. This was the Monday morning after that awful wreck on Wednesday night. Since then, I've spent a lifetime working for OC, various churches, and now, close to the end and at the end of Romans, looking back on that, thinking, that's going to go ahead and last, and I'm happy about that. I need to add a little footnote here. It wasn't long, months, after that Monday morning when I went to work, when a woman named Mary Parks came into the picture. And we know about Mary Parks and her story. If you all happen to know where she is and what she's doing, well, let us hear from you. So, we're finished with Romans. In formal study, I suspect we'll want to read it some more and benefit some more from it. Let's have a prayer. Lord, thank you for circumstances that let us study the Bible together. And thank you for our respect for it and our love for the Bible. Increase our understanding and increase our ability to live out what we learn. In Jesus' name, amen.